Welcome to today's webinar, Forms Best Practices. My name is Victor and I'm a Product Marketing Manager at Smartsheet. Today we're going to discuss forms, and we're going to look at three main areas for forms. The first being creating and customizing forms, including how can we create a form, how we can customize a form both by the fields that are available and how those fields are visually reflected, how we can make questions or fields required or hidden, as well as the logic that we can leverage that it's going to allow us to dynamically surface fields or questions that we want answered in the form. Once we've created a form, we're going to explore how we can collaborate with forms both by sharing it as well as being able to embed it in websites or dashboards or even work apps. Finally, we're going to explore how we can use automation in order to stay on top of the new submissions that we're receiving from the form, as well as how to manage and archive existing submissions. We're going to spend most of our time today in Smartsheet in a demo, but before we head into that, I want to talk about our form builder, which is a component of the demo where we're going to be spending a lot of time in. In our form builder, we're going to be able to manage the questions that we're going to be asking, define characteristics of these questions, whether they're default questions, hidden, or required. We're going to be able to create the logic behind these questions, allowing us to manage the experience of a submitter based off of the responses that they give us. We'll also be able to create a more visual and engaging experience for submitters through things like text formatting or custom branding. We'll also be able to modify the layout and security and the actions that happen after a submission. Now that we've reviewed some of the content that we're going to talk about today, let's jump into our demo. Today, we're going to start our demonstration by working with a template set in our Solution Center. While we're going to be using a template set today as the foundation for our webinar demo, it is important to note that any sheet can be used to capture submissions from a form. And perhaps more specifically, you can create a form on any sheet. The template set that we're going to use today is called Request Management, and this template set is set up to collect requests. However, depending on what your needs are, you could easily modify this template set to serve your own purposes. Forms in Smartsheet offer us a lot of versatility, and some examples of how we can use forms for a variety of different use cases and across a number of different business needs include ticket collection for IT or webinar suggestions for someone in marketing like myself, feedback collection on a presentation such as the one that you will all receive after this webinar, requests for budget for folks that are in finance, or even orders for things such as equipment, supplies, or swag. When working from a template set as we will today, you can select the Learn More button, and it'll bring you to a page where you can learn more information about the template set in question. Here we see the page where we can learn more about our template set. And what we're going to also be able to do is to select this download button, which is going to allow us to download a copy of this template set. This template set includes sheets, reports, and even a dashboard. But for right now, I want to focus on one of the sheets that's within this template set called the Request Tracker, where we're going to be able to set the foundation for our form collection to collect submissions. Here we have the request tracker sheet that comes with this template set. This sheet is where we're going to be able to collect submissions from the form that we're going to build in a few moments. On this sheet, if we look at the columns, we can get an idea for what type of information we're going to be able to collect, such as the description for the request, or we have a drop down that's going to give us an insight as to the request type, a flag that represents urgent requests. And while this is what the sheet can look like by default, we're also able to edit this sheet. We can add in more columns for information like assignees, for example, if we want to assign these requests to different individuals. Or we can add certain system fields that would automatically track things like when a request is received. Before we get into building our form, it's important to call out that each column that we have on our sheet is going to correspond to a question or a field that we can have filled out via our form. And it's important to call this out because as we consider designing and building a sheet, we need to ask ourselves, does each column that I include on the sheet need to be a question on my form? The answer to that is probably not. We may include columns in our sheet that we can use to do things such as manage the follow-ups that we're going to have on those submissions. So, for example, if we did apply that assignee column, that isn't something that we'd necessarily want somebody that's submitting to be able to fill out because they may not know who something's going to be assigned to. Or a checkbox column that we can use to track requests, or a drop-down column that we can use to track the status of those requests. Adding a column, it's just as simple as right-clicking and determining that we want to add a column left or right of an existing column. Now, on the subject of the columns, it's also important to note that we have different column types, and we have other webinars that go into depth about sheets and how they're structured, but this is important to call out because if we look at some of these column types, they're going to have different properties, such as a drop-down list column is going to have different options that we can work with, and the form is going to respect that. So based off of some of the different column types that we're going to offer, such as the drop-down list column, or a date column, or a symbols column, we're going to be able to respect the different attributes that are going to come along with those different column types. Now that we're familiar with what our sheet looks like, we can start the process of creating our form. When we select the Forms button at the top of our sheet, we're going to have a couple of different options. We can create a new form, or we can manage existing forms that already exist. Now, with this template set, we already have a form that's been created, but what we're going to do is we're going to actually build a form from scratch to show you all how easy it is to get started with the forms. While we're going to be creating a new form, you can also modify existing forms or make changes if you create a form and want to come back to it later. So these are going to be very flexible, but let's go ahead and select our Create Form button here. When we select Create Form, this is what's going to bring us to our form builder that we talked about in our slides. Within the form builder, this middle section is what's going to show us what our form is going to actually look like. And if we think back to what we'd said earlier about every column on the sheet becoming a question for our form, we can see here that all of our columns automatically become questions. But we're going to be able to actually edit this and change this form to fit our needs. If we see a column here, a prompt, a question, a field, I've been using those words kind of interchangeably, we can remove them one by one in a couple of different ways. I can go ahead and hit the remove button on the right hand side to actually remove a question. I can drag a question off of the body of our form, or we could actually go ahead and remove all of the questions that we have here. And that's what we're going to do right now to give us a completely blank form to work with from scratch. When designing a form, there are different factors that we may want to consider. We want to make sure that the questions that we're including are ones that we want to ask, but we also want to consider the copy or the words that we want to include with this form to let users know what they're participating in. So if we look right now, the title of this form is Request Tracker with Form, but that might not be very user-friendly with the people that are receiving it. So something that we can do is we can actually change the title here. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll change that to Employee Requests. And we can format this, we can make it bold, italic, we can change the colors that are going to go along with this. We can change the formatting of this to make it more user-friendly. And we can also add some description text to let somebody know what the form is for. So this form is to collect requests. And doing something like this really starts to give somebody insight and understanding as to why they're actually working with this form and what they may be prompted for. Now, again, formatting and changing the text here allows us to start creating a better experience for the person that's going to be working with it. And now that we've seen how we can start formatting and changing and working with the text, what we want to review is what we've talked about so far. So we've seen our sheet and we see how it serves as the foundation to create forms and how that's going to ultimately be where the submissions are going to get housed. We've started to see the form builder in action and how we can start to create a brand new form from the prior page where we select the option from the Forms drop-down button to create a new form. We've looked at removing fields or questions that we don't want to ask, and we've started exploring customizing the form experience. Now, what I want to do next is start adding some questions or fields or prompts so that we can start seeing how we can configure and customize a form. If we come over to the left-hand side here, this is where we're going to see all of those fields that we can use as part of our form that we're creating. These still correspond to columns on that prior sheet. And when we want to add fields, we can go ahead and either hit this plus button on the right-hand side of the field that'll add, or we can also add fields by dragging and dropping them on top of the body of the form. Here we've seen two different types of prompts or two different types of fields that we've added, and we see that the way that someone could answer it or submit a response is going to be different based off of the properties that we've established within the column on the sheet. So if someone's going to mark this request as urgent, they'd simply see a flag that they can either select or leave unselected if it isn't urgent. And for the date need by field that we have here, they're going to be able to use a date picker as opposed to having to go in there and type out long form what day they may actually need something. So this starts making the experience a little bit more tailored based off of the properties that we've already defined within the sheet. Now, we've seen how to add fields. Now let's start exploring how we can customize the fields once we've added them. And a first area to look at is with labels and help text. So we see here, for example, that the label for our date need by is date need by, and that's because that is the name of the column that we've set up on the sheet. But if we're requesting or we're sending this as a part of a form for someone to fill out, we may want to change that label to make it a little bit more user-friendly or a little bit more intuitive to the person that's actually filling that out. And changing that label won't affect how we see it on our sheet. So it provides us a scenario where someone may be filling out the form as one question or one prompt, but the way that we're capturing it on our sheet is going to look different. If we want to change the label, it's as simple as coming over here to where we see this label text box and filling in what we want. So we want to change the label to a question. And that question that we're going to do is, when do you need this by? And we see that as we change the label here, the label above the date picker is going to actually change. And similar is what we did earlier on with formatting the text and adding help text with the title of this form, we can also add help text here. And we can come in and say, for example, if needed less than 7 days out, mark as urgent. And this is a way that we can come in and start offering somebody more insight as to the process or certain conditions that may be applicable. Now, with the formatting that we offer here, we can make it bold, italic. We can even add in a hyperlink to maybe a form or some documentation that you have somewhere else that may assist with how this prompt is actually working. So to this point, we've seen how we can come in and add different fields and start changing some of the formatting of those questions that we have, as well as how our form is going to be able to start treating different types of information. Now what we're going to do is let's add another field and start seeing some of the other configurations that we're going to have available. The next field that we're going to add to this form is going to be our request type field. And when we add the request type field, we're going to see that it's actually populated based off of a drop-down list column. Before we explore how we're going to be able to work with it as a drop-down list column, I want to talk a little bit about making questions required or hidden. Now, with any of these questions, you have the option of making the question required. And what happens when a question is required is someone has to answer that field before they can submit that request. And this is really useful if you're collecting certain information that you absolutely need to go forward with. So you can apply this to any of these fields. We also have an option to make a question hidden. And hidden questions are going to work really well with this default value field option that we have at the bottom. So what you can actually do when you make a certain field hidden is you can actually populate a predetermined values, the default value. So let's use access here as an example. And what happens when we set a default value is if someone doesn't change this particular dropdown, the answer is going to be access. Now, when we partner that with making it a hidden field, what's going to happen is anytime someone submits this particular form, the request type is always going to be access. And when we start thinking about how you can use this for use cases for yourself, you can create different forms for different groups or different areas where this form might live, and you can collect insights to say, this is going to be the marketing team's form, and they can disperse the form amongst themselves, and every single time someone submits that, the request is coming from the marketing team. Or another example is if you wanted to embed different versions of this form on different pages, different web pages, different dashboards, you can track where the most requests are coming from by using and leveraging this hidden field. So let's go ahead and make this question not hidden now, and we'll go ahead and set the default value back to a blank field here. Now that we've explored the dynamics of making a particular field required or hidden and working with default values, I want to come back and look at some of the properties that exist within this field, especially because it's a drop-down list column. Now, because it's a drop-down list column, we're going to be able to display this question in a couple of different ways. We can look at it as a drop-down as it is configured right now, or we could also leverage vertical radio buttons or horizontal radio buttons to make the question appear a little bit differently. And this all comes down to preference. There's no right or wrong way of displaying the field, but based off of your needs, based off of what you're trying to achieve with the form, this gives you one more layer of control and one more layer of flexibility when you're actually designing your form. So far we've seen how we can work with symbols columns, date columns, drop-down list columns. The next field that we're going to work with is going to be a text number column. So let's go ahead and add our request description. And when I've been adding these fields, I keep calling out what type of column they are. Some of you on the call may have noticed this, some of you may not have. In the top right-hand corner, we're actually going to be able to see the properties of the field that we're adding. So we see that for the request description, it's a text number type column. Now, all of the things that we've mentioned so far, from the label to the help text to being able to configure whether the field or the question in case is going to be required, hidden, or setting default values, they're all going to still be possible for this field as they are for all the fields. But because we're working with a text number column this time, there's going to be an additional configuration that we're going to be able to do that's going to give us some control over what the responses look like. And that's going to be our validation. And with validation on the text number column, what we're going to be able to do is restrict the response to certain formats. So I can restrict it to only allow number responses, or only allow percentage responses, email responses, phone numbers, and we can restrict this to a certain region. So if there's a different format, if there's a different way that the phone number is configured, we can go in and force that. Or we could set up no validation at all. And when we set up no validation at all, as a default, we're going to display a single line of text to respond, but we could also encourage longer responses by making it multiple lines of text. And when we start thinking about some of the ways that folks have leveraged this particular field type, you can, in the default value, add in some help text or some prompts that you want somebody to answer, such as steps that you've taken in this case, working along with the theme of this being a request for access or change, things that you've tried so far, or requests that you maybe have done in the past that you wanted to be referenced, or a PO number that you might have available. If there's multiple questions that don't necessarily fit in boxes that we have above or other formats, This is another really great way of being able to work with it. So whether we're setting up a validation of the data, whether we're setting up no validation and encouraging maybe more of a free text, free form type response, those are both really powerful ways of being able to work with this information. So far, we've designed a pretty good form. We can capture a request and understand if it's urgent. We know when we need it by. We know what type of request it is, and we could even describe the request. But let's say we wanted to add a new field. We have a number of fields up the left-hand side panel that we're working with right now, but let's say the field that we want to add doesn't exist yet. Now, thinking back to earlier, all of these fields are going to correspond to a column on our sheet. So would we need to leave this form builder to add a new column? Thankfully, we don't. There's two different ways that we can add a new field from this form builder. We have a button at the bottom of our fields that's going to allow us to add a new field. And when we add a new field, we can name that field, which is going to correspond to a column, and we can determine what type of column it's going to be. The other way that we can add a new field is what we're going to do right now and actually add it from the form itself. So if we hit a plus icon underneath one of the questions that we have, we can go ahead and do the same thing. And we're going to add a field that's going to explain why the request that we're submitting is an urgent request. Now, what I want to do right now is I'm going to actually set this up as a checkbox column right now. And the reason that I'm going to set this up is if we create a field, or if we already have a field that exists that has a certain property, but we determine that we want to change that, we can actually update that from within the form builder without having to go back to the sheet. So we determine that it doesn't make sense for this question to be a checkbox. I can go ahead right back up to the top right hand side and edit the field settings and turn this into a text number type column where someone's going to be able to explain why this request is an urgent request. Now, taking a step back, if we evaluate this request, or if we evaluate the form that we're allowing people to submit requests from, rather, we have a prompt here that's asking somebody why a request is urgent. We want to require this, but we only want to require this when a request has been marked urgent. So we have a little bit of a dilemma right now. Do I make this field required? Well, I don't want to do that because every time someone would open the form, they would need to fill this out whether something was urgent or not. Or what we can do is we could take advantage of logic that exists with forms. And that's going to be a really powerful component of our forms. So let's explore that right now. Within every field that we have, next to the field button that we have on the right hand side of our sheet, we have a logic button. And if we select that, what we're going to be able to do is add logic that's going to make sure that based off certain conditions that may be presented, we can surface different fields and treat the experience in a little bit different of a way. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to create a rule that says that when the urgent flag is selected, what we want to do is we want to make the question underneath it, why is it an urgent request, appear. And now what's going to happen is these two are going to be linked so that when someone fills out this form, they're only going to be able to see this question if they've marked the request as urgent. And this gives us some flexibility with how we can create this form. And there's other ways that we could expand on this logic, but it's important to know that we can create rules like this that can really tailor somebody's experience as they're filling out a form, and we can show them the required information or personalized information, maybe to the type of request. If we were to use this with the request type, for example, if they were going to mark this as a purchase, we might be able to ask them what billing department this is going to come from, or if we're going to ask for access, they might have a drop down that says access to what. There's a number of different ways that we can take advantage of that logic component. To this point, we've focused our webinar on how we can create a form, how we can manage the fields that are involved with a form, adding in new fields that may not have existed before. And we've learned most recently about the logic that we can incorporate to make these forms more functional. But there's a couple of other elements that I want to introduce here just under the fields that can allow us to better organize and better work with our forms. We have different form elements that we can use that can allow us to organize the form better. And they're going to be heading and description element, a divider element, and then a file upload element. So let's see what these are and how they work. So I'm going to go ahead and add these to our form. Now, our heading element, we're going to be able to use this and drag and drop it around our form to help call out a certain section. So if we wanted to apply a certain theme to this form and say, these are going to be the questions that are going to relate to, information around the request, I can go ahead and label this and say information about the request. And going along the lines of this heading, maybe we just wanted to apply a simple break. This divider achieves a similar end. We see the heading and description and the divider as elements that we can use to organize, but the file upload is going to have maybe more of a functional element here with regards to something that you're going to receive. When we add a file upload element, it's going to allow someone that is working with your form to submit a file that's going to get attached to your sheet. And they can upload multiple files. So if you wanted to collect peripheral information to a request, or capture a PO, or capture any type of other information that might have some visual component to it, you can go ahead and request a file upload. You don't need to use the form elements, but you could use them if you wanted to. And going along the lines of the logic that we mentioned earlier, you can also make these visible based off of the logic that you create. So if you only wanted to conditionally make the divider or a heading or the file upload conditionally available based off of the answer that you receive somewhere else, that's something that you can do. If we come back up here to the top, there's another element that I want to call out, and that's going to be how we can format the background. And this ties into changing the visual appearance of our form to make it more accessible, more user-friendly, maybe more visually impressive. You can use this to help stay on brand and give the form a little bit more of a personalized, custom look to your organization. When we format the background, we're going to have a couple of different options. We can change the color that we're working with, and we can do this both by looking for the hex code or the RGB number, or even dragging around and maybe trying to find a color that we like that fits a certain theme. And when we find something that we like, we can just go ahead and apply it, and we'll see that the background here is going to change in line with what we just selected in our formatting of the background. We're also going to be able to apply an image or a GIF. And this is another really neat way of making your form stand out. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to apply a GIF, and we're going to be able to see what that looks like with our form. So we'll go ahead and we'll apply a GIF. And when we apply this, we're going to see that the background of our form is going to update to reflect the GIF that we've just added. So it makes the form feel a little bit different. What I want to do right now is I want to transition away from this kind of core form builder experience that we've been working with, and I want to dig into some of the settings. And this is where we're going to be able to see some other elements about how we're going to be able to configure our form. In our form settings, we're going to be able to set some of the foundation of how we're going to be able to collaborate using our form. At the top, we can change some of the theme of how the form is going to be set up, whether we want a vertical layout or a side-by-side layout, a plain layout. We're going to go with side-by-side right now. And then this is where we start getting into some of the other layers of how we're going to be able to collaborate, such as applying security that requires somebody to log into Smartsheet in order to access your form. By default, the form is going to have its own unique URL that you could share with anyone, whether they use Smartsheet or not. But if you wanted to only capture requests from people that are within the Smartsheet, this is something that you can apply to manage your experience. We can also apply a CAPTCHA that would reduce the likelihood of spam. We can manage what happens upon the submission of a form, whether we want to display a confirmation message, reload the same form, or redirect the user to another link. We can determine how we want this form to actually appear on the submission. So every time we submit something, do we want it to go to the top of the sheet or to the bottom of the sheet? And we can also give people the ability to send themselves a copy of the submission that they've just made. When we have settings that we want, that we like, what we can go ahead and do is save that. And now our form's basically created, and we can start considering how do we want to interact? How do we want to engage with other people? When we want to share with people, we have a share form button. And this existed on the prior form builder page that we had as well. But you can go ahead and email the link to the form to different people. You can leverage the link that's going to be created for this form. You can embed the form, and we'll see this in a couple of moments. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this for later. So remember that we copied this. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to actually open this form, and I want to come back to the sheet for this. So we can open the form from here as well. And what I want to do is I want to fill this form out to actually see how we are going to be able to work with it and how it's going to appear on our sheet. So let's go ahead and test out our logic. We'll mark this as urgent. And when we mark it as urgent, we see that that field applies. That lets us know it's an urgent request. We'll go ahead and we'll fill out all our other values. We'll say that it's for access. And we'll go ahead and submit this form. And we get our success message that our form's been submitted. Now let's jump back to our sheet. Now, when we come back to our sheet, we'll be able to refresh this sheet. And at the top of our page, we should be able to see that that new form's been captured. So we just refreshed our page, and we see that at the top of our sheet, we have that new collection, that new form submission, and all of the information is in the right place based off of what we made available on the sheet. Even that column that we created from the form builder asking why this was an urgent request. We can reorganize this and change this from this view, but today we're not going to do that. Now, what I want to do right now is I want to touch on automations. We have a number of other webinars that touch on how to build automations and how to manage automations, but I did want to make you aware of the fact that with forms, you can also combine this with our automation capabilities to build workflows that will alert someone and let them know that they've received a form, or set reminders based off of submissions, automatically assign people to different requests that are being submitted or forms that are submitted, or kick off things like approval workflows. There's a number of different things that you can do leveraging the automations. Now that we've touched on automations and how that's something that we can possibly use, what I want to do now is I want to actually transition into the dashboard that comes with this template set, so we can actually look at how we can embed the form that we just created a couple of moments ago into that dashboard. Here we are in the dashboard that comes with the template set. Now, this is an example of a dashboard, and some of you on the call may have worked with them extensively. Some of you, this may be the first time that you're working with dashboards. But when we're working with a dashboard, we have an option to edit them in this top right corner. And everything on a dashboard is going to be called a widget, but we have different types of widgets. Now, on this dashboard currently, we see an example of one of the ways that we can incorporate a form into a dashboard, and that's going to be as a shortcut widget. And when you use a shortcut widget, it's as simple as including the URL to what you want to link somebody out to. But what we're going to look at now is the web content widget, because we want to look at how we can actually embed a form within another Smartsheet resource like a dashboard or even a work app by extension. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the web content widget, and this is where we're going to be able to add in that URL or that embed code that we'd copied a couple of moments ago when we were working that form builder. So let's go ahead and paste that here. And when we paste that here, when we apply it, we're going to be able to see that that form has been created here at the bottom of the page. And we can expand this, and it's going to look more and more like what we just filled out within its own URL. And this is going to function the same as the form would by accessing it just by the link. So now that we have our web content widget set up, what we can do is we can actually use this and save our dashboard. And this is going to function just the same as it did via the URL. It's one more way of being able to incorporate this form in another area. Now let's jump back into our presentation to close out our webinar today. Today, we reviewed a lot of content, but I especially wanted to call out a few points. We saw how we can create forms with a single click and build them out by mapping the fields that exist as columns on a sheet, as well as how we can create new columns if they didn't exist on that sheet to support things that we're trying to answer with the forms. We saw some of the ways that we can improve the collection of quality data by adding things like help text or making certain fields required or hidden or default, and some of the other formatting elements that we have available to us within the forms. We saw how we can go and leverage our conditional logic to ask people the right questions based off of the submissions or the responses that they've already given us. And then finally, we touched on acting on some of these submissions with automation and even including them within dashboards. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. I appreciate everyone that took the time to engage with us by asking questions, and I hope that this session's been helpful. We will be sharing out the recording to all participants that joined, and I look forward to seeing you all on a future webinar. Thank you.